Carlson, staff president of TACA, we're thrilled that there are so many friends of the arts that are here today. To all 10 of them? Zanetta? Jerome? Donna? All 10? How many have been to 5? That's great. How many are TACA Perforum rookies?
Wow.
Now that's great. That's great about a brand that has loyal customers and has new customers. So we're thrilled. The topic today, meeting community needs, is intended. 18 months ago, when TACA finished a strategic plan, a key driver of that plan is for TACA to take a leadership role in connecting the arts community with other sectors of Dallas. It is critical to our mission. In the development of a new cultural plan for the city of Dallas, the Office of Public Affairs has taken a much broader look at meeting community needs than in the past. We invited the director, Jennifer Scripps, to visit with us for a minute this morning.
Good morning, and thank you, Wolford, and thank you to the TACA Board of Directors for convening another Perforum. I was trying to count, I think this is my 4th one, so I'm nowhere near a decade of experience. But when we started meeting, the group that was kind of on a steering committee or a little discussion group thinking about themes, and Zannie was helping us moderate it. Obviously, this theme dovetailed beautifully with the cultural plan. We spent the last year engaging more than 9,000 Dallas residents about the value of arts and culture, the definition of arts and culture, which is broader than many people had assumed, what they wanted out of arts and culture, how they experienced it, and any of the barriers that they might be experiencing. And so we were thrilled to be able to convene leaders from all over the country to come. While it was great to talk to 9,000 Dallasites, sometimes also you would say, well, that's the Dallas perspective. What are they doing other places? So to be able to spend time today to hear from people doing exciting work, I've been following some of the work on museums in particular, is really a treat, and I would encourage all of us today. It's also wonderful to see so many of you from different forms of art. A lot of times the theater people give it the theater people, or the music or visual, and the thing about Perforum is it's everybody. In many of the ways the cultural plan meetings were, and many of the way our arts audiences experience the arts. They want to partake of it all. And so I'm thrilled for today. I want to thank everybody who participated in the cultural plan. Thank you for caring enough today to be here to engage in these conversations, and we are thrilled as we move from doing the work and planning to implementation. And God willing, and the creeks don't rise, City Council approves this on November 28th. The work is not done. It's kind of like bringing a baby home from the hospital. The real work begins, and we look forward to working with each and every one of you over the next few years. Thank you.
We're all indebted to the Communities Foundation, who is the lead sponsor today, and they have been for a number of years. On the back of your program, you'll see some other sponsors that have been terribly helpful. KERA's Art and Seek, and they're live streaming the program today. The Fairmont Hotel, the Artisan, the Nasher Sculpture Center. When we finish and go to lunch, we're going to have lunch at the Artisan, which there will be people who will help direct you, but we'll go out the front of the Nasher, go across the street and down a couple blocks for lunch, and we're going to have lunch outside. Also, when we're done, in the next couple days, you'll get an email, and we'll be interested in your feedback about your experience today. We have a killer committee that helps us decide this program. Megan Bowden-Wilkinson, Mary Brewer, Rosara Cruz, Zanetta Drew, Gwen Eccles, Lauren Embry, Jennifer Scripps, Suzanne Smith, Jeremy Strick, Clyde Valentine, Donna Wilhelm, and Jeff Woodward. If you ever need a committee, we'll let you borrow them sometime. They're just great. So TACA doesn't have a Hall of Fame, but if we ever had one of the people who would be in the first class is Zannie Voss. She has been a spirit and a moving force with TACA for a number of years, on the board, in charge of this program, and just being emotionally supportive of our organization and supportive of us and helpful in many, many ways. So it's my pleasure again to introduce Zannie, who's going to moderate and has been so instrumental with guiding that committee that I just recommended, and express my appreciation to Zannie and everyone else.
Thank you. Thank you, Wolford. How's everybody doing today? Good. It's great to look out and see so many familiar faces. We're elated, all of us here, to have the opportunity to share this conversation, echoing the thanks to Communities Foundation, Embry Family Foundation, to the Nasher Artisan Craft Kitchen, KERA's Art and Seek. Thank you all for the support of making today possible. And a great thanks to TACA, to Wolford, Maura, Greg, to the TACA staff for organizing and giving us this opportunity. This is really an exciting time to be in the arts in Dallas. Do you agree? I mean, there's this great sense of vibrancy that all of you here have created. There are deep community bonds, which is really exciting to see, continuing to develop and deepen bonds with the community. It's a very ambitious community. It's a very caring community. And at the same time, we still face challenges. Nice thing is that we don't face them alone. These are challenges that are faced by communities throughout the country. So we don't have to figure this out by ourselves, and we don't have to recreate the wheel. This is really a chance for us to quietly on a Monday morning say, let's get together and think about how could we take it from here. With all the good work we've done so far, how can we take it from here? The theme of today, as Wolford mentioned, the panel discussion is meeting community needs. And I'm going to go off my own script here a little bit. So I'm thinking about, for those of you in the room who are alumni of the program I used to chair, you've heard me say this a million times. You know, I think about Philip Kotler's definition of marketing is meeting needs profitably. And in the nonprofit sector, it's simply about meeting needs. And yet, we oftentimes fail to listen. We like to talk. You know, so I think about, yesterday I was on the phone with an airline company and had an issue that I was trying to resolve, and they couldn't help at all. And at the end of it, they asked if I would take a satisfaction survey. And I wonder, do we do that? You know, do we say, we don't really want to change anything about the way we're doing what we're doing, we just want you to like it. So would you please be satisfied? And I think about myself as an arts fanatic. I'm still wholly engaged and fulfilled socially, emotionally, intellectually in arts and cultural experiences. You know, you walk around the Nasher and the ARP exhibition that's up right now is incredibly fulfilling. And at the same time, I know that for more than half of the arts and cultural sectors across the country, there's declining audiences. You know, I don't know if any of you are feeling that here in the room within your own organizations, but there are declining audiences, and that happens to be the trend. We know from looking at data that 57% of people who have an arts and cultural experience for the first time never go back. Not back to the same organization, but not back to any organizations within their market. And I think about what was it about that experience that left them so unfulfilled that they said, you know, I don't need to ever do this again. So what is it that we need to think about and to change to ask the question, how can we better meet needs? You know, how can art better serve the community? And that's really the point of our discussion today. It's understanding, you know, what are the attitudes, the values, the perceptions of people in the community, and how willing are we to change somewhat what we do to better meet those needs? Because only by doing that, I think, are we going to increase our relevance. You know, otherwise we risk becoming obsolete. And with the changing demographics, with changing consumer preferences, how are we taking all of that into account and shaping, not changing our mission, but being willing to think about, are we willing to change how we deliver on that mission so that we do a better job of meeting needs? It's a huge topic. There are great examples from many of you here in the room who are already doing an incredible job of building a sense of relationship and meeting needs in the community. The intent in the panel is to say, looking to the future, what are ideas that we can develop, that we can steal, that we can borrow, we can adapt, that makes sense given our environment here, collectively? So not just within our own organizations how to meet better needs, but what are collective ideas that we could advance here in Dallas so that we would have a larger and a deeper footprint for the arts in North Texas? I've asked each of the panelists, I'm going to introduce them in just a moment, to take 15 minutes and talk about how meeting needs is prevalent in their work and in their own communities. And then we're going to have an open discussion, and I know this is not a shy crowd, so there'll be plenty of questions. And what I'm going to ask you to keep in mind as you're listening to the panelists is what hits home. Make a note of the things that really resonate with you most. What are the ideas that you hear that you think, oh, wait a minute, that's something that I've not considered or that we should consider collectively? Because when the panel is over and we go to lunch, we're going to be seated at tables. And at those tables, there are going to be table moderators. And I'm going to ask that at the table we focus discussion on what resonated most, what are the ideas that we can develop here in Dallas moving forward. Ultimately, what we want to be able to do is increase relevance for arts and culture. And so I'm going to take a moment, I'm going to turn you to your programs for longer bios. I'm not going to just read the bios, but I'm really honored, thrilled, excited to be sharing this stage with 4 outstanding panelists. It's an impressive group. I think you'll agree with me. We have John Hinojosa, who's the Artistic and Executive Director of CECI, which is a creative youth development organization in San Antonio. John's a trustee with the National Guild for Community Arts Education, and he's received AFTA's Arts Education Award for his achievement, so nationally recognized. I've been with the organization more than 20 years, really impressive work. Elizabeth Merritt. Elizabeth is the Vice President of Strategic Foresight and the Founding Director of the Center for Future of Museums at American Alliance of Museums at AAM. She's also the author of the Alliance's Trends Watch report. And if you've not followed it, I'm sure you're going to want to after today's discussion. To my left is Ken Tabachnik. Ken is the Executive Director at Merce Cunningham Trust. He's also a Clyde Fitch Report contributor. He has an illustrious career as an arts educator, a consultant, an arts manager, a reformed intellectual property attorney, and an intermittently practicing artist as a lighting designer. And Carlos Contreras, over on the other end, balancing out my anchor here, a poet and a director of marketing and innovation for the city of Albuquerque. He's a published author, a Kellogg Community Leadership Network Fellow, and a champion national performance poet. So I'm going to start off by asking John to get us started. Talk about your work with CECI. And your organization's mission, I thought this was really interesting. Following the mission on your website, you say, we value artists, empower marginalized communities, and advance culture. So how do you go about your work with youth to live these values and to meet the community's needs?
Sure, I can answer that. Good morning, everybody. I'll just tell you that, so I'm just down the road from y'all, and the other piece is I run an out-of-school time program. And so I mentioned yesterday that I'm not a morning person because I like afternoons, and that's why I'm going first.
I did that intentionally.
So it's a great question, and I'll sort of lean into it in sort of all kinds of different ways. I myself am an artist masquerading as an arts administrator. So I got a degree in painting quite a few years ago, and was able to see the need and the issues that were happening in the San Antonio community when I finished college. What was happening then, and unfortunately continues to happen, is that our public schools are overwhelmed. Our public schools are focused on, again, assessment and testing, which is very important. But what happens specifically with creative youth is that they don't have a community, and they don't have a home, and they don't have a place of belonging in public schools. When we first started, the largest school district in San Antonio is San Antonio Independent School District. We don't have a unified school district too. That's another issue that's part of the dilemma is that there's 17 distinct school districts within the boundaries of Bexar County. We serve primarily urban inner city economically disadvantaged youth, so San Antonio Independent School District is the school district we serve the most students from. But back then, there were 51 elementary schools, and of those elementary schools, not one of them had an art teacher. There were 17 middle schools, and of those, 14 of them had an art teacher. And then high school's better, right? All of a sudden, you've got a drama program, a visual arts program, music programs, et cetera. But by then, kids who were interested, potentially would look at opportunities to be creative are sort of lost because, and then the other piece of it is that they become dumping grounds from the counselors because people have this perception of, what are we going to do with this kid? Well, let's put him in the arts. The arts are easy, right? And the arts are the most complicated, amazing kind of thing that you do. And so what happens is, again, these classrooms get filled and the students who are really interested and want to be engaged aren't, because their teacher is dealing with classroom management versus teaching and sharing and mentoring. So I run a program called Say See. The acronym is San Antonio Youth Yes. We use Say See now. We'll be 25 years old next year. Super exciting. It's going to be a great celebration for us. We have become nationally recognized as an organization that does good work with young people in the arts. There's a new term that people are using, and it's called Creative Youth Development, CYD for short. And really, some people get sort of confounded by that, but the reality is it's a new term for long-term work that's been happening for a long time. It used to be called arts education. It used to be called, again, sort of culturally committed community-based programs that work with people during the out-of-school time hours. So the piece that's CYD is, while it's a new term, it's been happening for a long time. And the reality is it's about consistency and long-term and focused impact versus one-offs or a 6-week program or a 4-week program. The success of our program is because we have a middle school and a high school program and do community programs outside of our facility. So a student can apply and get into our program in the 6th grade, and as long as they meet the commitment that they're supposed to meet, they can stay with us for 7 years. And so, so that sort of long-term commitment makes a very big difference. The other piece that's really important is that we're completely tuition-free. Because we work with economically disadvantaged youth, there is no cost to be in our program. But there is a commitment, and so if a student applies and gets in, it's a competitive program. They have to actually sign a contract. So the student signs a contract, the parent signs a contract. I sign the contract, and whatever program director, whatever program, then they're inside a contract. And what that means is that the foundation is there. This is what you are going to provide. This is what we're going to provide. And let's work together for your success. So that's a really important part of this work that we do. So in many ways, commitment is the currency. You know, when you say free, you say, well, if it's free, what do I care? The reality is that there has to be a commitment on behalf of the students and the organization to be successful. I'm going to talk a little bit again about what meeting community needs, because it's something that we started with a visual arts program 25 years ago with 8 students. We now have 250 students in 5 distinct multidisciplinary programs. So we've grown quite a bit based on the need and the commitment. So we have a visual arts program still. It's our largest program. We also have a theater program that's based on Boal's Theater of the Oppressed. So the work that happens in the theater as they're performing on the stage, they're performing their own work. And then there's opportunities for audience engagement and conversations. We have a film and photography program. And then we have a new media and game design program. These are all high school programs, and then we do all of that again on Saturdays in all of those programs, and that's our middle school programs called Working Artists and Mentors. And so the program has grown and expanded, and then the other piece I think that's distinct and different in San Antonio versus Dallas or other large urban municipalities is that San Antonio is the 7th largest city in the country, but at the same time, it's really interesting because it's not a multicultural city, it's a bicultural city. 65% of our population is Latino, but even more importantly, 65% of our population is not just Latino, it's Mexican American. San Antonio is sort of the gateway to opportunities for Mexican citizens. So it's really interesting because, again, when you look at the demographics, Dallas is a multicultural city. Houston is a huge multicultural city, New York, Chicago, et cetera. But it's really interesting, again, because the dynamics of this sort of interesting perspective. So again, the majority of our kids are Latino, but Mexican American. Do they define themselves as Latino? No. They define themselves as American. And so it's really interesting because if you're going to listen to the community, again, our youth are who we serve and the reason that we've expanded and grown our programs. So while they not necessarily consider themselves Mexican American, culture and cultural aesthetics are important to who they are, though. But more importantly, gender equality is even more important to their beliefs and their interests. And then the other piece that's really important, and it's a thread that weaves through all of our programs, is this idea of social justice, or just justice in general. Food justice, neighborhood justice. So again, the reason that we're an organization that has its mission statement as it is it's based on the conversations and the discussions we have as a community and sort of understanding that culture and listening to our students. So I'm going to talk now really sort of a conversation about, okay, so how do we meet our community needs? So again, our programs started small and grew and expanded because we were listening to our community. I'm an artist, I'm a painter, I don't know how to code, I don't know how to be on a stage, except for sort of these sort of environments. And I'm not a filmmaker, but what we saw and what we heard from our community is that these were programs that were needed and not available. And so we built those programs. The other thing that I think that's been really successful for us, and I mentioned this last night at our dinner, is that when we start programs and when we build programs, we pilot them. So we never just say, okay, our kids in our community say that we need a film program. We're starting a film program. No, we start very small. We build the participation based on the current students that we have because these kids have said, I want to be a digital storyteller. I love painting and drawing, but I want to be a digital storyteller. So we start small, and then we pilot it, and then we assess. And we do that through pre and post evaluation, having conversations, looking at what we do. And then the most important thing we do is we adjust and change. And that for lots of organizations and people is really uncomfortable, right? Because you think you've got it. And then when you hear back that no, you don't have it, that's a little uncomfortable, but the other piece is unless you adapt and change, then you're not going to grow and you're not going to sort of reach your full potential. The media arts program actually started very similar to the visual arts program because our visual arts program is focused on entrepreneurial skill sets and opportunities. So our students create work. We have an amazing exhibit space where they put their work up. We work with them on pricing their work. And then if their work sells, they benefit from the sale of the work. So the way that it works is that a portion goes into an individual scholarship account, and then a majority of the money goes directly in their pockets. So it was a process and a model that really worked in visual arts. So we thought, well, let's create this media program, and let's teach our kids how to create logos and stationery and designs, et cetera, and let's go market it to communities and businesses. And use this entrepreneurial sort of model as the thing. After like 3 months, our kids get, no, we don't want to do this. We want to be digital storytellers. And what you're asking us to do is something that once we learn it, we are ready. There's not sort of an arc of creativity in that process of designing a logo. So the idea is that we want to be able to tell our own story. So we adapted and changed. And I could say that with all of the programs that we've started. Our game and coding program started really small and very focused, and now has changed into really new media and what new media means. I'm about halfway through probably, right? Okay, so what does community need, and who, as an organization, how do we look at that, and how do we take the steps that we need to do things right? So we're in a 26,000 square foot facility, a beautiful, inspiring space in the heart of the Arts District of San Antonio. We didn't start there, but we recognized 15 years ago that as an we're a mid-sized organization. Our budget's $1.1 million. We decided a long time ago that we needed the expansion and we needed the space, and 26,000 square feet of space sounded like the perfect number of square footage, right? It's a pretty big space. I was telling folks is that my colleagues from the Northeast, when they come to visit me, get square footage envy because they're so used to being tight and stacked, right? In Texas, we have more land. So we're in the heart of the Arts District. We got a great deal on the building. It was an empty, unconditioned warehouse. We did 3 different building campaigns to completely make it the home that it is now. And it's a beautiful space, but it was also smart of us to have invested in that property. Well, guess what's happened in our area? It's completely gentrified. The area, every piece of land is being turned into a condo, not a condom. There are some on the ground, but that's a whole different story. Condos, duplexes, apartments. Everybody wants to be in that area. Everybody wants to be in that neighborhood. So guess what has happened? The value of our building has significantly increased. And the reason that we initially were there was because we wanted to sort of help develop and grow and provide this economic development. So what we're doing now is we're going to sell our building, because right now 40% of the students who apply to our program don't get in. And it's not because they shouldn't be in our program, it's purely because we're at capacity. So we're going to grow our programs, we're going to expand and add new programs based on community need and input, and we're going to move to an area, the zip code in San Antonio is 78207, and it's one of the most economically devastated zip codes in the city, in the state, and in the country. And the reason that we're doing that is that's where we belong. That's where we should be. That's the community that we want to serve. Those are the students that will benefit and have the strongest impact by the work that we do. So we've been putting a lot of conversations and discussions into this with our students, with our board, with our leadership council, but more importantly, we've been having conversations and dialogues with members of that community. And there are great cultural organizations, culturally specific organizations in that community. They're super excited about the opportunity of what it's going to mean for us to be part of that as well. But we're having conversations with individuals and health and human service organizations and human service organizations about what we can do collaboratively and together to not come in and look at it from a savior mode, but come in and look at it from this idea of how we partner, how we collaborate, how we grow and create these opportunities. So the term that I use, and I don't know how many Mexicans or Latinos are in the room, but what we're going to do is we're going to move from gentrification to gentification. We're going to commit to the people. And the idea is not for displacement, but the idea is to build that community and make it's already a rich, culturally amazing space, but there are people that are uncomfortable about crossing the bridge to get to that location. So that's the kind of conversations that we're having. It's super exciting because I should be thinking about retiring, but at the same time, this is a new opportunity. And then the other last sort of thing that I'll talk about is that one of the things as organizations that we have to look at too, so I am the founding artistic executive director of SACE. I've been doing this for 24 years. I love my work. It's so vital and important. I couldn't imagine doing anything else. But I also have to look at the future. So this new opportunity, this new cultural arts center is part of our future and growth. This building's actually, by the way, 98,000 square feet of space.
Wow.
It's the utility bills already are scaring me, and I haven't even seen it. But the other piece for me is that we have some amazing staff. Of our 14 staff, 5 of them are alumni. That means that they went through our program, they went and got their college degree, and then they came back and said, I'm here to work, and I'm here to work, and then there's this passion and commitment. What we were mentioning yesterday, the other sort of great sort of information for you all is that, so our kids are 3rd and 4th generation Mexican American. We have a 100% high school graduation rate for the last 16 years in our program. And the graduation rate in SAISD is about 65%, but that doesn't even account for minority students. That's actually lower. But more importantly, 100% of our kids get accepted into colleges and universities all across the country. And these are first-generation college students. These are kids whose parents did not go to college. So that's where the whole youth development part of our work comes in, outside of the creativity. Creativity is at the core, but youth development is the kind of commitment that we give. So the thing that we're also doing now, because we have such amazing, great alumni who are part of our program staff and our administrative staff, is that we are moving to succession planning. I always want to say succession planning just because we're in Texas. But so the idea behind that is 2 of our alumni who are currently our executive lead staff will be taking over the roles of the organization. And as I reminded them, see, that it's taking you need 2 of you to do the kind of work that I'm doing. In many ways, it should be 3. So I hope I answered some of the questions. There's some great folks here on the dais that are going to be able to talk to you. But the cool thing that I love about, I respect and know these people even though I've never met them, so I was excited about this panel. But what's really great, I think, is that your committee did a really great job of sort of looking at diverse ways of talking and meeting community needs. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I find it really intriguing, this idea of, deciding, are you where you need to be to serve the people you want to serve? And if you're not, then, do you have to make the incredibly large decision of, do we need to move what we're doing closer to the people that we're trying to serve? Really remarkable. I'm going to turn now to Elizabeth. I think about this idea of meeting needs. You could say, well, it's just being reactive. That it puts you as an organization always just responding to somebody else. When I think about your work, it's all about looking to the future and leading, being out ahead of change. So I'd love for you to talk about generally what is futurism, and how does it help museums shape the experiences that they offer to do a better job of being relevant to their community?
Thank you, Zannie. I'm bringing 2 perspectives to my remarks today. One is as a person working at the American Alliance of Museums, I'm somebody who's working with the broad museum field, all different kinds of museums. There are maybe 28,000 of them in the US. As a futurist, what I'm doing is looking at what's going on in the world, the trends that are shaping society and technology, the political trends, what's happening out in the world in the ecology, and economic trends. And I'm trying to see how that influences the opportunities for museums to do more good in their communities. So for example, later this week I'll be in Miami. And if you were in a museum in Miami, you might look at 2 trends. You might look at the increase in wealth inequality, and you might look at rising tides due to climate change, and you might notice that Miami is facing a future in which they are worried about what's being called climate gentrification. So you have property developers looking at formerly affordable, diverse socioeconomic neighborhoods and saying, you know, 20 or 30 years, that might be the new coastline. That's going to be the hot coastal property. Maybe we should buy that up. And it's forcing people out of communities that their parents and grandparents had lived in for generations. If you're a museum in Mississippi, you might look at the fact that the rate of obesity for children in Mississippi is somewhere around 40%, with all of the implications that has in the long term for diabetes and heart disease and cancer. And you might say, what could we be doing to help children in Mississippi have access to affordable food and healthy food and not be residing in a food desert, or to know more about how they want to take care of themselves and be able to prepare food, or activity. How can we help get them moving and do fun things and have positive body image so they're not feeling shamed about this? Those are all of the ways in which I try and help museums look at the world around them and think of how they might respond. But it can be challenging. I'll say, as a museum person, having worked in museums my whole adult life, I have decided after much reflection that museums are like belly buttons. And I say this because there are two basic kinds. You have your innies and your outies. And innies are museums that usually are started by people who are deeply passionate about some kind of stuff. So you have your transportation museums, you have the train guys, sorry, it's usually guys, running train museums saying, these are the best things ever, you know? Or you have somebody who has a collection, I'm not making this up, a collection of paperweights, and they start a museum about paperweights. And sometimes it's an art collector who has a beautiful collection of art, but the common theme here is a passion about that stuff that you're sharing with the world, which is great. It's wonderful to share passion. But it's starting from the inside. It's saying, look at this wonderful thing, how can I share it with the world? Whereas the outies tend to be formed by people who said, you know, that's something we need to help with. Let's go, for whatever reason, solve that through a museum, which I think is a great strategy. So as an example, in the 1970s, there was a big wave of founding of children's museums, a lot of them by people in the Junior League who said, there's a need for early childhood development and good out-of-school experiences and socialization and enrichment. Children's museums are a good way to do that. So you had a lot of children's museums start around then. Now, there are also museums, and unfortunately, here's where the analogy breaks down. Thank heaven. Innies can change to outies without radical plastic surgery. And it's a good thing, too, because if you look at the data on participation in the arts broadly, you'll see, as Zannie referenced, that over the past decades, there's been a steady and troublesome decline, not in arts participation overall, that's the good news, but if you look at the survey of public participation in the arts, you'll see that over the past few decades, involvement in traditional forms of art, so looking at museums or symphony orchestras or opera, that has been a slow and steady decline. There's been, if you look at the arts writ large, there's been robust participation in more informal forms of art, salsa dancing, poetry slams, making rather than just watching. So a lot of people are taking up craft and arts themselves, which is great, but it doesn't reassure the museums who have their attendance going down. We just got the results of the latest analysis of the last round of the survey of public participation in the arts. And for the first time since they started doing it, which was, I think, in 2002, we're seeing an uptick, which is great. And I think it's because more museums, many of which started as innies, are becoming outies through applying a number of strategies. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about 4 of those today. So one is sharing authority. One is responding in real time to the events of the world around us. One of them is realizing that museums are inherently not neutral. And the fourth is beginning to tackle the difficult work of decolonizing our practice as museums. So if you look at sharing authority, this is a trend that's driven in part by an underlying technology, the fact that we now have lots of ways to communicate very personally and immediately with people who come to museums. It's not just they come in, they hear a lecture, they read a wall label, they have a phone in their pocket. You can be talking to them over Twitter, you can be listening to what they're saying on social media, you can invite them to contribute their opinions. So, for example, back in 2008, you had the Brooklyn Museum of Art creating what I believe was the first crowdsourced photography exhibit called Click. And they put a call out and said, what are the photos you like of your neighborhood, of this community? And then people voted on their favorites and they did an exhibit. You had, in 2013, the Chicago History Museum saying to the community, hey, we're your museum. We're about the history of Chicago. What do you think the next big exhibit we do should be about? They had a crowdsourced competition for topics, and then people voted on their favorite. And they now have the next major exhibit, which opened in 2015, permanent exhibit called Chicago Authors. I think that's the name. It's about the authors who originated in Chicago, which I have to say is not the exhibit I would have thought the public chose. So that was kind of cool. But also in a very real but even deeper sense, it's reflecting a movement and approach that started in the 1990s in the disability rights community, which is sometimes called nothing about us without us, right? So it's a shift not only to two-way communication, but sharing of authority, of saying we're not just talking about you. If you're part of this story, you should be telling the story as well, right? And that's a process that is playing out in a lot of meaningful ways, especially with some new museums that are beginning to tell the stories of previously unvoiced populations. So, for example, in the UK, you have the Museum of Homelessness. I'm looking forward on this trip to learning more about the Dallas Museum of Street Culture. So we're starting to say it's not just that you're going to be an observer and say, hey, I see those people over there, let's talk about them. It's going to them and saying, how can we use our platform and resources to help you be in charge, to be the people telling the story, reflecting what you think is important. The second thing that has been shaped and enabled by changes in culture and technology is the speed of the news cycle. It's traditional in museums that a major exhibit can take 10 years to plan and put up, right? And that's great, and it can be beautiful and very nuanced and deep. But if you're on a 10-year cycle, you're not really speaking to people about what happened in their neighborhood last year or yesterday. In 2014, when Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, Missouri, the Missouri History Museum opened up to the city for a community forum to start processing the aftermath of that terrible event. In 2016, when Keith Lamont Scott was shot and killed by a police officer in Charlotte, North Carolina, that was on Tuesday, September 20th. By Thursday night, the Levine Museum of the New South had opened itself for a community forum talking about the shooting. And they took an exhibit they'd already been working on that was going to take them 3 years to put up. It was called No Justice, No Peace, which is a pun. It's K-N-O-W, but with the N-O in parens. And they had it up in 3 months because they knew the community needed that as a place to talk about and process these terrible events. So being willing to go and jump into a messy and hard conversation and say, we may not get it right, we don't have the wisdom of reflection over time to say this is what happened, but to say we know we can help now with what is happening was a very profound shift. And I think that a necessary adjunct to that has been this realization that museums, in fact, are not neutral in their positions. This is something that really gives museums anxiety attacks when they're faced with the ability to tackle a topic. Some people may say, well, can we do that, or is that taking a position? And it's kind of freeing to realize that the neutrality was an illusion to begin with. Every choice that went into making that museum, the things that you collected, the place that you cited it, the people who were on the board of trustees, the people that you hired, the language that you used in the wall labels, those weren't neutral. They merely were so deeply embedded in the worldview of who those people were that they didn't see it as being a point of view. And being able to back up and realize that, I think, frees museums to say, no, let's make conscious choices. Let's be aware of what position we're taking. And sometimes that requires being brave. The Penn State Penitentiary, oh, am I going to get Eastern State Penitentiary historic site outside of Pittsburgh? Nope, that's outside of Philadelphia. Thank you. At least I got that on the record correctly. It's a prison museum, and for a lot of its existence, it was the sort of place you'd go, and you'd have the little frisson of, oh, this is the cell where Al Capone was imprisoned, you know, ooh, that's cool. And it is cool, and it's history. But at some point they sat down and said, wow, what this site really reflects is the phenomenon of mass incarceration in the US, which is a huge problem in our society. It's something that started after the Civil War as a way of oppression that would replace slavery. It's something that has shaped and wounded our communities. It has torn apart families. It's damaging our economy. It's undermining our ability to be a civil society. Let's take that on. Let's really say, if you're going to come to a penitentiary, think about those issues that are reflected in what it was built to do, who it housed, and what's still going on in the active criminal justice system. So they built an exhibit where when you walked in, you're confronted by this huge red sign that says, have you ever committed a crime? And to get into the exhibit, you have to either pass to the right or the left of the sign, and thereby answer yes or no. I haven't actually seen that exhibit, but I think I'd really have to sit there and think about it a while, because, you know, and then they get more and more nuanced. So it's not a question just of have you committed a crime, but how were you treated or not treated depending on who you were, because justice is applied differentially in our society. So there's an example of a museum confronting, taking exactly who they were and digging in and saying, okay, neutrality is an illusion. Let's make a conscious choice about what we want to do with the position we're taking. And then what I'm beginning to see museums being willing to take on is the very difficult practice of decolonizing their own practices. So any institution is a product of its history and the people who started it and the culture that gave rise to it, and museums are no exception. And for that reason, museums often have deeply embedded in their DNA the violence and injustice that are part of the history of the societies that formed them. And it's very difficult to surface that and confront it and figure out how to deconstruct it. Part of it is simply acknowledging that it's there. Part of it is going back to this issue of sharing authority. So you have museums like the Abbey Museum in Maine saying to the indigenous leaders of their community, you know, this is your museum too, this is your history. Come in and be part of the people saying what's going to be done, how it's going to be interpreted, and teaching us how to talk about this. Sometimes it's going back and reflecting on how those histories are embedded in what you have. So you have the Art Gallery of Ontario went back and they looked at the descriptive labels on their paintings, the titles on the paintings, and saying, you know, yes, it's true that the artist may have named this work Indian Church, okay? But right there, that's erasing the history of the individual tribe and people whose culture is reflected in that building. So let's try and be a little more nuanced and accurate and sensitive to how we talk about these things, because how words have power, and how we tell the story to people is going to influence how they feel about what we're showing them. And then you also have museums going back and saying, these are complicated histories of race and power as well. So for example, the Worcester Art Museum went and looked at their American art galleries with all of these beautiful portraits of men and women in their fine clothes, carefully posed. And they said, you know, there's so much unspoken that's reflected in those portraits. The society and the economic system that gave those people the wealth to be able to dress like that and commission a portrait. The people who are not shown in most of the portraits who did the work behind the scenes. So they went through a process of adding wall labels. They didn't take away the original ones. They said, let us tell you a little bit about the history of these people. And many of them were slave owners or made their wealth in industries that benefited from slave labor. So it's surfacing those hidden histories and adding the facts to give people a more well-rounded view of the world, because those portraits are a very narrow window, and unless you help them look through the window and into the world reflected behind it, they may only see the surface. I think all of these trends are more generally part of museums beginning to see themselves as universal basic assets at the service of their communities. So they're looking inward and they're saying, let's deconstruct who we are. We have space, we have authority, we have influence, we have knowledge, we have reach. How can we put these in the service of the community and say, you tell us, how can you use these assets in a way that serve your needs and bring yourselves up by being able to build your knowledge and your authority and your credentials and your economic power based on the assets we've collected.
Fabulous. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you. Lots of great food for thought already, and we're only halfway through. I'm going to turn now to Ken. Your career has spanned so many different positions and locations and organizations. Tell us about how you view your work through this lens of what does our audience want. I've read a lot of your blog posts, and I think that it's a really kind of remarkable shift in how you approach audience. So.
Great, thanks, Zannie, and I'm thrilled to be here with my colleagues. And as John had said, it's an incredibly diverse group of points of view. Let me start by trying to frame my point of view. My career has been mostly in and around institutions, either directly involved with them or managing them, overseeing them, helping them with their strategic goals, and usually institutions that have resources. And I want to be very clear that that's a particular point of view because so many organizations struggle with resources and having the resources they need, the capacity. And I've been blessed and privileged to generally have been in situations where the institutions have had access to resources even if they don't have them. And so that's a very particular point of view, and I want to frame my comments from that point of view. I'm going to talk about three things today, or frame my conversation really in three big parts. The first is sort of how I came to the point of view that Zannie alludes to and the way I look at the world in this area. I'll talk briefly about my current work, which is all about meeting community needs. And then I want to talk a little bit about a project I was involved in a couple of years ago that I think is possibly a good example of how an institution might be able to re-examine or reframe its point of view in order to come up with some different solutions. And I guess I'm going to jump ahead and give you my sort of closing thoughts now, which are to say that where I'm driving to is that one of the critical things to being able to think about this topic and how does one meet their community needs is being extremely clear about the difference between your why and your how, as Simon Sinek, a colleague of mine, would say. And what I mean by that is it's something Zannie alluded to earlier, which is being very clear about the mission of your organization or the work that you're doing and not confusing it with the how you do that. And so it's very easy to think, an example I'm very familiar with, that because you are a company that puts ballets on the stage, or a ballet company, that you really think that's what your mission is. And it may be, but it may not be. So making that distinction is really a critical piece of being able to step back and reframe things. Now, why is it important to reframe things? So in about 2004, I became the general manager at New York City Ballet. And as I was talking with one of my colleagues here earlier, you never really know what you're going to find at an organization until you're inside, sitting at the desk and digging into things. And I found a lot of things at New York City Ballet. They've been in the news recently about completely different things, which luckily I did not have to deal with in my time, though there were plenty of other things. But what I found was that if I looked at the attendance, starting in 1983 when George Balanchine had passed away, to 2005, so shortly after I had gotten there, so what is that? I can't do math so quickly, 22 years, I could draw a straight line at the attendance decline, year over year over year. It was a steady decline. The company was not threatened, as I said. It's a company that had resources, had access to resources. There wasn't a question of the company going out of business. But it made me think, if we are only selling 65, 68, 71% of our seats, what is going on when the company used to sell 100% and people would line up to get tickets and you couldn't get them? That's 25 years where nobody had been asking that question. And I spoke to my colleagues around the country and realized that this was a common phenomenon with most of the performing arts organizations where I knew people. The slope might have been a little more steep or less steep, but in fact, everybody had been experiencing a steady decline over decades, in fact, and people hadn't really been paying too much attention to it until the economics really started to change. I started to think about this and wonder, well, what's going on? And at the end of the day, my conclusion was, we're just not relevant like we used to be. Now, what does that mean? That's a really big statement to make. And how did I come by that? One of the things I realized or concluded, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but I concluded, is that the issue wasn't about price. And I say that because I was hearing that all around me. Oh, the ballet tickets have gotten so expensive. And at that time, City Ballet still considered itself to be, sort of as it was historically, the people's ballet company, and felt it had a need to have cheaper tickets. So the tickets at City Ballet at that time were well under $100 at Lincoln Center. We were the only organization. ABT top ticket was $130, I think, at the time. So we were about 60% of the ABT ticket price, our colleague ballet company across the plaza. But the critical piece was that my son, who was younger at the time, his colleagues, and all of the young people I talked to were completely willing to spend $200 on dinner or go to a rock and roll show. So clearly, if there was value for them, they would spend the money. So my conclusion was it wasn't about ticket price. Now, that might have been part of it. I don't want to dismiss that at all. But clearly, there was something else going on, and I concluded that it was relevance. That's the shorthand that I use, is that we were not talking to them in ways that mattered to them. I'm going to stop about City Ballet and segue now and just start from that point of view to say, how did I come to this issue? The work that I do now at the Merce Cunningham Trust, how many people know who Merce Cunningham is? Oh, good, more than I would have thought. So I'm, again, in a very privileged situation. Merce Cunningham was one of the leading artistic voices of the 20th century. And he, unlike many other performing arts organizations, really just wanted to do his work and didn't really care what people, how they responded to it. And he said, I'm not going to tell you anything. I'm not going to give you anything. In fact, as a choreographer, I'm not going to give you the music. And I'm not going to give you the scenery. It's all going to be there, but you're going to have to figure out what it means because they're not tied together. And that was really his big artistic statement, is that each of these individual elements of a performance could exist on their own, and audiences would make of it what they wanted to. He left behind a very clear instruction that there not be a company, so we don't have a product to sell at the Cunningham Trust. He left a body of intellectual property, which is completely ephemeral, the choreographies. He left some writings. He left a series of processes that he used, which I think have tremendous value. But we don't really have a product that we can sell to people. So my day in and day out business is going around to people and finding out what their needs are and then trying to fit in these assets that we have in a very concrete way to give them value. Now, of course, it's always going to be related to movement or to ideas about movement. That's the how of what we do. But everything that we do is going out to communities and trying to build partnerships with them. We've just started the centennial celebration of Cunningham's birth. His 100th birthday would have been, or will be, depending how you look at it, April 16, 2019. It was a great year, 1918, Jerome Robbins, Leonard Bernstein. I mean, the list just goes on. There was a tremendous fecundity, I would say, in the genetic pool at that period. I don't know what was going on, who was drinking what, but a lot of 20th century giants were all born within a very short period of time. We've just started celebrating the centennial, and my entire framing of it for the trustees at the trust and for the staff is, I want everybody in this world who wants to celebrate Merce Cunningham to be able to do it in the way that they want to do it, not how we want them to do it. So we are not producing any part of the centennial except for one event, a large event on his birthday, and all the other programs that we have are built around what does somebody else want to do and how can we make our assets available to them in some fashion and in some way for their community that brings value to them in their community. So we're going out to them in very, very concrete ways. One of the things that has driven me to that point of view is, again, now alluding back to City Ballet, my conclusion that the audience has changed fundamentally. And I thought at that time, and I believe it now through the introduction of digital technology and the way it has encroached on our world, that young people today process information differently, live socially differently. Their entire experience of life is different than mine is. Sorry about that. Is different than mine is. I don't really understand it. I feel like sort of I'm looking or reaching into a black box where I feel these things in there and I can kind of feel that they're different, but I can't really tell you what's in there. Almost like a doctor who can see the symptoms, and it's an obscure kind of disease, so I'm guessing what it might be, but I don't really know. But I can recognize that it's very, very different. And I thought about this decline at City Ballet because, in fact, what we also found was not only was the decline steady, but the same people that were coming in 1983 were still the majority of people who are coming today. They're buying fewer tickets, but we could trace. There were 15,000 households buying tickets, subscription tickets in 1983. There were 13,000 buying them in 2005, and the vast majority, far and away, over 70 and 80% were the same households, and they were buying fewer subscriptions. Just to add to that, what Lanny said about people not coming back, we knew from the data that we had that over 90% of people who came to City Ballet the first time did not come back. And if you ask them, did they have a good experience, their answer would be yes. So it wasn't, again, it's a complex sort of set of circumstances that I'm describing, but all of this led me to believe that audiences have changed fundamentally, and that the organizations that I'm involved with have to change fundamentally and take a different outlook. So I've talked a little bit about my organization and how we go to meet people, and what I'd like to do is shift and talk a little bit about what for me was, I thought, an extraordinary experience that I had when I was doing some consulting work. It was with a major symphony orchestra. I'm not going to tell you which one, but it was one of the major ones in the country. And I was on a team of consultants who was hired to help them consider their relationship with their community. There was a lot of discussion, not only on this project, but on other projects at the time, about the collapsing or the differences, whether there are differences between educational programs and community engagement programs within arts organizations. What does that mean? We did not get into defining those, and I'm not going to give you the answer to that here today. I know that conversation continues, though there has been some shift in it. This organization, and again, I want to just frame my comments by saying that what you're going to hear is strictly my perception of what happened. And so if you were to talk to people at the organization or talk to some of the other people involved, the stakeholders, they might have had a very different experience or very different perception. But what you'll hear is strictly the way I perceive this and what I thought this organization was looking for and how we addressed their needs. The organization had recognized that while they were extremely strong, extremely solid, financially stable, not in any danger of going out of business or anything like that, I would describe that they sensed and knew that they had a certain relevancy problem. They knew that they were a performing arts organization that performed symphony music, classical music, which means you have to gather a certain amount of resources. You need all the players, you need all the rehearsal, you need the time for them to be together, you need a place for them to perform. They had a home that was their own, and it was a well-established and very well thought of and respected part of the community. And what we found when we went out into the community is that whether people attended or whether people came or not, they considered this institution a source of pride within their community. So even if they weren't buying tickets or going to this organization, people were very proud of it and that it was in their life. But there still was this disconnect. We spoke to, I think it was 120, 125 stakeholders. That included orchestra members, ticket buyers, patrons, board members, educators in the community, members of service organizations in the community, community members in different parts of the metropolitan area. And what we heard, and I'm being very sort of simple here, I'm simplifying rather, the messages and some of the nuances of what we heard. But what we heard overall is that it is difficult for many of the communities to feel the connection, though they feel the pride, because first of all, it's difficult to go to a performance. It's difficult to get downtown. And again, this is not only about price, parking, babysitter, transportation, all of this adds to a barrier to the experience for many people. So while as almost everyone we spoke with wants to participate, they don't all have the means, and I don't mean financial means. They don't have the physical ability. They don't have everything that they need to make it something that they can do. We found that there was a real geographical distance, I would call it. The fact that by and large, and again, I'm being simplistic here, by and large, the institution lived within the building the symphony hall that they had, there was a real feeling that it is remote, and I sense that in a visceral and physical way from many of the stakeholders. We went through a long process, and thank goodness we had a visionary leader, a very supportive and strong leadership team. The trustees seemed to be completely behind this and supportive of this process. And we, after reporting back on this, suggested, and again, I'm reducing the process for the purposes of time, we suggested two programs, two ways to approach these, the issues that we thought would in fact answer the question that had been posed to us: how can we bring greater value to our community? One of those was to get out of the Symphony Hall and to embed itself within the community. And I don't mean doing performances. That was only a piece of it. What we suggested is long-term programs that began, 3-year programs, that began with a year of listening within the community, of finding orchestra members, and the orchestra members on the committee were completely supportive of this. And I'm not going to talk about the complexity of the financial, the work rules, and all of that, because the organization was willing to take all of this on. But the idea we were proposing was that members of the orchestra spend a year in the community, working with the community, delivering the services that the community wants, whether that be lessons, whether that be master classes, whether that be history of music, whether that be organizing local groups, but that really the orchestra make a commitment, that the symphony make a commitment to these communities, and to do it in different communities over time. So a 3-year process, 1 year to just spend time listening to the community, find out what they need, and develop a plan, how can we service that. A year of providing the service, and then a year of transition, because nobody wanted to walk away and leave the community all of a sudden without any of that value that had been brought to it. So part of the plan really was also to ensure that there was essentially a succession plan for each one of these, and it could be different, community to community. But it was a very direct connection, a very direct way that we imagined the symphony orchestra could, without giving up its work in the Symphony Hall, still put on the performances, but could actually find a way to identify, to define itself differently within its mission, to keep the why that it had of delivering classical music to its community, and separate the how that it had through the performances of the symphony orchestra, and think about how to deliver value, how to meet different community needs, to think about how can we go to the community instead of the community coming to us. I say it like that because one of the things I realized about City Ballet, going back to that, and I'll quickly wrap up because I know I'm out of time, that seminal experience for me was that I realized that in the second half of the 20th century, putting on performances was enough. The audience wanted to come to the theater, they wanted to come to the Symphony Hall, they wanted to come to see opera, and they thought that made them better people. And for whatever reasons, it was economically more feasible, it was the getting around in cities was more feasible, whatever it was. That was a model that worked, and that model developed with the largesse of some of the larger foundations beginning in the late 40s and 50s. That became the model that I think we're now struggling with to get past and redefine into a new model. Let me just very quickly tell you the second program, which worked off of the same principles, but was in a completely different direction. We also looked around at the community and knew that one of the things we heard was that other institutions wanted to build bridges to the symphony orchestra, and they felt that they didn't have ways to do that. But they felt that if they aggregated their assets together, they could really deliver much greater joint value. We saw a tremendous concentration of medical and biotechnology companies in that area, and we recommended that the symphony take some of their assets and do an investigation with some of the institutions in that area and see if they could build programs. And this came out of the work and the research that I had done around how is music working in the health area. And there's a broad spectrum, it's an entirely different discussion, but the work that's going on, which is really fascinating, goes from something as simple as helping patients heal better through hearing classical music and being in a good frame of mind, to actually replacing anesthesia with classical music. There are reported incidents, maybe you've read about them, and there's a study about, in fact, it began with a violinist, I believe in Pittsburgh, or maybe she played viola, I can't remember, who had breast cancer, had to undergo a mastectomy, and she played her instrument throughout the entire operation without anesthesia. and she had to convince the doctors to do this. Obviously, it was incredibly successful, but there's now been repetition of that. It wasn't the only case. So we saw that there's potential, if the symphony was willing to investigate this and invest in it, that there was also potential here in a very, very different way to really make an impact in their community and in other communities. And it was a way for them to get beyond the limitations they felt and address some of the needs that were out there in their community that we helped them to understand were there.
Great.
So,
thank you, Ken.
yeah.
I love the idea of a year of listening. It just sounds like
great.
It's such a simple concept, but and why don't we do it more often? So last but not least, we have Carlos. Carlos, your title is Director of Innovation and Marketing for City of Albuquerque. How do you create these community movements that involve business, art, culture, and where do arts and cultural organizations kind of fit into all of that mix in creating value?
Sure. Hello, everybody. This is one of those days where you wish you went first, by the way. You're like, they've said it all, and they said it so eloquently. My job with the city of Albuquerque is interesting, and I think about it in spaces like this. For many of you sitting in a chair and hearing somebody that works for a fairly large city as a director of a municipality, it doesn't quite fit on days like this, right? And I think that's been one of the most interesting parts of this journey for me is recognizing all the ways that art doesn't fit into bureaucracy, but also recognizing that and then figuring out ways around it, through it, and ways to balk at that not fit, right? To call question to the reality that just because it's never fit before doesn't mean it won't fit. And so before I came to my space as the marketing and innovation director at the city of Albuquerque, I was a teacher for 5 years in the high school setting. I have taught at the University of New Mexico in Chicano studies. I was a marketing and advertising person for a small business in Albuquerque in the brewing industry, not formally trained. So very much of that was arts engaged and guerrilla marketing of sorts. And I took all of those things, and when I got a call from our mayor, Mayor Tim Keller, to as an appointee to sit in my space, took all of those skill sets and tools and figured out how they weren't going to fit as the director of marketing and innovation at Albuquerque. It's been interesting. We've been there about a year. The mayor has sort of turned City Hall inside out. So when we talk about City Hall now, we don't talk about City Hall, we talk about Community Hall. When we think about things and confronting the issues and real kind of problems in our city, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Albuquerque, but crime rates are fairly high. Homelessness is a real problem. Opioid addiction is on the rise, and Albuquerque seems to be one of the places where it's taken hold across the country. All of those things are very real problems. We have the DOJ in our city enacting reform for our police department. And so all of those things have coalesced to put us at a point in 2018 where we have decided that we need to do things a whole lot differently than they've ever been done at the city of Albuquerque. That decision included not only me as a creative, as a director, but about a handful that I can point at in my city that were poets or painters or program directors of arts organizations who are now directing city departments, who have got the call to be appointed as a director for the city, and now we sit in a room every Monday. I'm actually missing that meeting right now. Every Monday there's 24 of us, and we sit there and talk about how does solid waste work with Parks and Rec and work with Family and Community Services through my office to figure out pushing out a campaign that serves more than just picking up your trash, right? And those are awkward and interesting conversations because none of us have done it before. None of us have been in that space before. It's an attempt to create what our mayor calls One Albuquerque. And so I'll just kind of jump into that. My role at the city was to design, lead a design firm through a process that produced a logo of all things to start. And that logo was supposed to function primarily internally to begin with. And so when we went to the city, there's 24 departments. They all had some individual tagline. They all had some rendition of a logo. Some of them were cool. Some of them were not so cool. Some of them were like clip art. And so we looked at 24 logos, and Mayor Keller said, what I need is an overarching design that can, like, everybody can point to, and then within that find a sense of individuality for their very individualized and specialized work, right? So we hired a local design firm. We took an inventory of those things, and we sat down with directors in those departments and interdepartmental workers that had been there years and years and years. Something I continually call attention to at the city. When I sit in a room, I ask how long people have been there, because I've been there 8 months. So to sit in a space and make decisions for people who have worked for a number of departments to better a city for the last 25 years, to then talk to somebody that's maybe 10 years younger than them, and being given direction, that can be a very uncomfortable place to take direction from. It's certainly an uncomfortable place to lend direction to. So all of our conversations have been very collaborative because of that, right? And so we sat down with directors, we sat down with department workers, but then I took that creative firm and I said, this is out of your norm, but we're going to go into the community. And we're going to go talk to the community about if we were creating one thing for our city to point at and say, that's us, what is that one thing? So that process, normally through a creative firm, in Albuquerque anyway, takes about 12 to 18 months. We had 4 weeks, because we are an administration that is in a place of urgency right now, and so it's about getting a job done and getting that job done efficiently and effectively. In 4 weeks, we turned around a logo that within it, I should have worn the t-shirt, it says One Albuquerque, but if you've ever been to Albuquerque, we also call Albuquerque Burque. So if you may or may not know that, it points to the story of our original name and our sister city in Spain, Albuquerque, Spain. And the spelling's a bit different, but the extra R that's in Albuquerque, Spain, in the spelling of Albuquerque, Spain, pops up in this slang term for Albuquerque, for those of us that were born there and love it so much and call it Burque. So why am I getting at that? Because in this logo, that word is highlighted. So it's a jumble of letters that spells Albuquerque as you read through it, and the slang term or the nickname for our city, Burque, is highlighted in red. That's city red. So when you work for animal welfare, Burque turns orange. When you work for Parks and Rec, it's green. When you work for cultural services, it's turquoise. And at first, when we rolled it out, people hated it. Right? Internally, department directors were like, I don't understand it. I had to sell this logo that I fought for from like 24 choices to 12 to 5, and I brought 5 to the executive team, and fought for this in this particular one across the table with a mayor that's dyslexic and colorblind. Our first few conversations didn't go so well. It took me a few times. But really what we came out of the gates with, and what we've realized in developing this thing from a very kind of awkward space, and the executive team just trusting an artist to do that work, was a community calling itself what it's always called itself and embracing what it's always been. So we emerged the Burque we knew we always were to be the better Burque that we know we can be, right? Internally, that thing has allowed for folks to then take it and run with it. 20 of them liked it, 4 of them didn't. The 4 that hated it now put it on everything. There's Parks and Rec water bottles and solid waste vests and all kinds of things. But I think the win in that, and the reality of how does art serve community, is that it created conversation. It created space for conversation. It created space for folks to realize that to consider yourself important in the individualized work you do is also part of that role, is recognizing how your individualized work is part of a whole, right? When we're looking to serve a community and you have a specialized role that doesn't seemingly fit into anything else, it's very easy to then just focus on your job. You know, if you are the director of family and community services, it's a really interesting thought to think about how you might work with animal welfare, right? Until you're like put in a committee that forces you to do so, and then you realize all the possibilities that existed for years and years and years that you didn't like take a Monday to shed an eye on. So One Albuquerque as a movement now has spurred interest from our small business community, and we've taken this t-shirt and lent it to the small businesses. So we're now gamifying supporting local. The logo changes color, so now when we approach a small business, we say, pick your color that represents a city department. They're wearing them on Fridays at particular businesses around town, selling them for their own profit, and we're able from the mayor's floor say, go get a beer at Tractor Brewing and buy the turquoise One Albuquerque t-shirt. Go get a cup of coffee at the Brew and buy the fuchsia One Albuquerque t-shirt. What that does, again, is create space for conversation, right? So when folks are walking around town now wearing that logo, people start asking where they bought it, what does it mean? If you're not from here, what is the jumble of letters I keep seeing everywhere, right? If you are from here, you get to call it Albuquerque or you get to call it Burque, depending on how you were raised or where you're from. But either way, we're all in it together. So it creates a sense of community, all in a jumble of letters that changes colors. And some hope and possibility. All of those things were created in a very interesting way, collaboratively from my post, because that's all I've ever known how to do, right? My background is in teaching in classrooms. I primarily taught high school curriculum to adult-age learners in prison and jail settings before I moved on to do the marketing and advertising stuff. And then I worked at the university with adult-age learners, obviously. That's kind of a whole other slice of pie, because people have to take agency at a university when they're adult-age learners. You can like lead a horse to water, but can't make them drink, right? That very much is teaching university classes to me. Like, you can hand everybody the tools, all the tools in the world to better themselves or their community, but they have to want to do that. I feel like Albuquerque as a city, leaning on the resiliency and the resourcefulness of artists, is realizing we can lead each other to water, but we can't make each other drink. But if there's enough of us like standing over this water, somebody takes a drink, we might all drink, right? Like if we can model behavior that we want to see in our community from the highest levels of leadership, then the idea and possibility of seeing that action actually unfold, it's just way more possible. So it's not something that we have to force upon people. It's also something that we have to do ourselves, right? So when you talk about One Albuquerque, I tell people it's not just a video campaign. We hired a local production firm to do a number of like flashy videos for social media. It's not just a t-shirt that's locally merchandised. It has a backstory, but it also is tied to substantive work that this administration is doing. So our mayor ran on a platform of aiming to unify 9 individual districts in 24 different departments, because historically and traditionally, we sit in Albuquerque as a city of 600,000 in a state that's a population right about 1 million, as kind of the pivotal linchpin of success. If we are not successful in Albuquerque, New Mexico as a state is not successful. But in order to like push that success forward, sitting at the bottom of most lists, we had to be creative in how we approach that, right? And so the idea was then to bring everybody together, pool resources, and figure out how we get a job done together. So we don't work as 9 individual council districts in 24 different departments anymore. We work as one city. And so that means like rolling out things like Albuquerque Engage. I'm the lead on a project in downtown Albuquerque, Route 66, historic Route 66, runs right through the middle of our city. And in the downtown corridor where City Hall is, we're seeing a whole lot of vacant buildings. There's a whole lot of space up for lease or rent, and not a lot of interest. What that has also kind of turned over is the fact that dealing with the homelessness and addiction problems we have, and the fact that our transit system runs through downtown Albuquerque and becomes kind of one of the only ways that our unsheltered population can either get out of the elements or get around town when they do have enough money to get around town to another part of town. We get a high density of unsheltered, homeless, and addicted folks in downtown Albuquerque all day long, right? It has subsequently not become the most like the most attractive place to become a tenant, right? Thinking around those things, the city of Albuquerque started a project where we're approaching those building owners and asking for short-term leases at discounted rates with the aim of activating space and engaging the public in different opportunities. So we just signed lease terms with 2 buildings. So in one building, we're there for 4 months. We've paid for 1 month rent for 4 months of access, with the catch being if somebody walks in that building and says, hey, I want to put my bistro here, or my art gallery here, I want to become the full-time tenant to the tune of 2 years, we have 4 days to move out. But until that happens, we're there very happily, and we've put some creative makers and doers in the space. So now it functions Thursday through Sunday as an art gallery and a maker space for 2 individuals that we paired, and we're like, play nice, because we don't have a whole lot of time, but we have space, and you have access to this space. Those folks have turned it into much of a co-op. So they went and found like 4 or 5 other folks that do what they do, put a number of wares in that space and flesh it out very well. Whole marketing campaign behind it and whatnot on their own dime and accord. We then moved up the street, got a call from these folks that do AR, VR work and create experience-based dinners, looking for an empty building to put those in. Again, said, what are the lease terms? Kind of laid it all out on the table. They said, if we have $3,000 for the next 4 months, we'll sign a lease for the next 3 years. So the city of Albuquerque found $3,000 outside of itself because it's really hard to move things through legal and procurement. So we found $3,000 outside of ourselves. Partnered with a company called Fractured Atlas, which lends a whole lot of resources to, I'm sure all of you know what Fractured Atlas is, I don't have to explain it to you. But they're sort of a clearinghouse for artist needs. Fractured Atlas paired with us to supply Story Lab with that $3,000 and the ability to be a long-term tenant downtown. What's important about those spaces, though, is that we're creating opportunities for families to come downtown. So if you've never been to Albuquerque, much of what isn't empty right now in the downtown corridor is like bar, restaurant, bar, coffee shop, right? Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, that's all fine and good because we can all have business meetings. We can all get off and have a happy hour meeting. But I don't get off of work, go home, get my kid and take her downtown because there's nothing for her to do there, right? Until First Friday came along. So in this project, First Fridays is an arts crawl or art walk. Nationally, it's a thing. In Albuquerque, it's a thing. Arts Crawl was like your fine art galleries. They've been doing it for about 25 years in Albuquerque. Art Walk became your like lowbrow offering in the bar, coffee shop, restaurant, bar, right? So like there's about a dozen of them downtown. A gentleman by the name of Gabriel Gallegos started Art Walk and started approaching these venues to host art openings. When One Albuquerque Engage was pitched as a project from the executive team to the Economic Development Committee I sat on, I said, here's the deal, we're a city. We have no business like in reinventing something and taking money out of hardworking people's pockets that are already doing this work. There's an event called Art Walk. It has paired with Arts Crawl, and these individuals already promote Friday nights in downtown, so we ought to bring them to this floor and go find a couple of other folks that I knew doing similar work in other parts of town and ask them if they'd like to work together on contract with the city of Albuquerque to make their work more visible, to amplify their message, and to lift up everything that was already going on in Albuquerque that just needed more attention. So they allowed us to do that. We have three organizations now on contract leading this project alongside us. One by the name of Two-Way Street. Two-Way Street's a street vended paper, edited, written, distributed, all by unsheltered populations for their own profit, so they sell them for donations. Mariposa Music is a small outfit that hires local musicians to play local venues and then gives craft vendors micro vending opportunities. And then Art Walk, of course, Enchanted Pop-Ups, does much of the visual art representation and then splits profits of art sales on the walls of local venues. So I'm adamant about the fact that Albuquerque is in a space where my CAO says, you were brought here to make Albuquerque cool. And I said, ma'am, it's always been cool. We just need to remind people why. Yeah. And so a lot of that is just like meeting community needs is resources, right? Like when you work for a major municipality, you realize how much money goes out the door on decisions that were like half-thought decisions, on things that just like budgets that just go completely unused or underutilized. And so you realize the sense of power and access to resources you have, and then you just turn those over to the people that you've been working with and alongside for so long. So a lot of what I do at the city is find everybody that should be at a table when we sit down at a table that's not. And we bring them to that table. So another flip side to that's a little bit like not so pretty is in dealing with our homelessness and addiction problem. I'm like a social media nerd, and it's just part of my job is to be like on it 23 hours a day. When you're on social media 23 hours a day in a city that's hurting the way that Albuquerque is hurting, you get a lot of influencers from social service organizations and otherwise, activists and otherwise, that are, even when your mayor and leader has a 62% approval rate, they're not the happiest people in the world, right? People are addicted, homeless, and dying, quite frankly, and that's not okay. And so rather than ignore that, we take time to fill that out. We take time to hear folks. So like much of what I've heard my fellow colleagues on this stage say is like, you listen, right? You ask a question before you think you have a solution. So much of our time spent as directors at the city is creating space for those conversations and questions from people that didn't feel like they were listened to for far too long. Do we have an answer? Not always, but we think that we have a skilled approach and a skilled team that our answer doesn't have to be a silver bullet. Our answer can be a multi-pronged approach put quickly into action with pooled resources that aims to like move the needle in some way, shape, or form, right? So it's not about like we always talk about at the city. We are told we have a list of things we cannot say. One of those things is like, that's not my job. One of those things is like, oh, the prior administration did that. One of those things is like, oh, we don't know what to do. One of the things we can say is like, we know this doesn't solve the problem, but here's what we can do now. We don't have all the information, but here's what we know, right? If we can move towards a solution that makes people feel seen and heard in a community that is quite honestly like a multicultural city, then we just get further to serving everybody that lives there, whether they have an address or not, right? Like I think that's one of the biggest things that we've been focusing on. Our CAO, Sarita Nair, who's the youngest and only female CAO in our city's history, when we have conversations about access to things like Wi-Fi, we'll very quickly ask conversations about why those decisions and that access has not been created yet. And if she is not pleased with the answer, if she gets this was the prior administration or we don't know, we move quickly to answering that question in the ways that we know how, and that's in serving people and creating points of access for everybody in our city. So all of those things roll into like the resilience and resourcefulness that artists need to have, and so sitting in this space with a number of folks that are now department directors that were just creatives is a very comfortable place to be. I'll give you one last thing, and then I'm going to stop talking. We've talked a bit about like access. We've talked a bit about equity and inclusion and improving cities and communities through art. I sit in my space and say it all the time. Art is economic development, and community is in collaboration. So we were talking about cultural plans over dinner last night, and I said, the city of Albuquerque has a cultural services department that focuses on a number of venues in our city, but one of our most exciting additions to our cultural activities is the release of our new economic development plan. The economic development plan at the city of Albuquerque has 6 strategies. I'll talk about 2 of them because the other 4 I probably couldn't tell you right off the top of my head. I focus on 2 of them very heavily though, and one of them is creative placemaking, and the other one is an idea called the increment of one. Netflix just bought a building in Albuquerque. I don't know how many folks are familiar with that having gone down. That happened, and then we all chilled, Netflix and chill. It's a giant acquisition. It's the first U.S. holding of Netflix, so it's the first full production facility in the United States that Netflix has. That happened under our watch, and because of our administration, we invite those kind of companies to see Albuquerque as a point of hope and possibility as a mid-level city, but we're not chasing them, right? I will say the prior administration did, to the tune of like a Facebook and Amazon and otherwise, and the thought there being that when these companies move to town, they can put 1,000 people or more immediately to work, right? In a place that's hurting income-wise and poverty level-wise and otherwise, 1,000 jobs is a big thing. The only problem there is if 7 years later an Amazon or a Facebook or a Netflix decides to move out of town, you lose 1,000 jobs immediately. The increment of one in the new economic development plan is aiming to establish a city-based program much like your federal JTIP funds. So JTIP funds, if you qualify as a certain style of business or organization, the federal government will give you money to onboard somebody for the first 90 days. They'll pay their salary, half of their salary for the first 90 days. It gives employers a little bit less stress and the ability of training somebody, and if it doesn't work out, you only spend half your money. If it does, then your investment and your return on that investment is increased immediately, right? The increment of one in Albuquerque is aiming to establish by way of a nonprofit organization called ABQ3, which we created, funding for those kind of things. So we're going to have local businesses apply to then be funded locally by the city to onboard one person. And if we can get 1,000 small, locally owned businesses to hire one person, those jobs then become more sustainable. That money stays in our city, and those jobs don't go away as quickly as maybe Facebook closing its doors. So the increment of one is something that we're focused on very heavily in Albuquerque. We have a whole lot of homegrown commerce and small business that we think if we can continue to keep our money in town, it'll do a lot of good. Within that increment of one, procurement and purchasing at the city level has been literally combing through contracts one by one to identify work that is being done out of the city of Albuquerque or state of New Mexico that could actually be done locally. So it started with our mayor getting his business cards and saying, where'd they print these? And they said, well, those come from a company in California. And he said, not anymore. And then he went and had a cup of coffee and he says, where do we buy our coffee from? Colorado. Not anymore. We've now, in the last 90 days, turned around $1 million worth of contracts that is now spent locally in Albuquerque by way of individually asking departments to comb through their procurement and say, and we sit on a committee that says, come back next week with 10 things to look at, right? And so $1 million has been turned around in that fashion. Last but not least, creative economy, increment of one, creative placemaking. Well, okay, so let's, I'm like, did I say it all? I think I did. But creative placemaking in the sense of focusing on Albuquerque, here we go, the rail yards. We have a space made for local makers that go to every Saturday, right? So we have craft vendors that pop up every Saturday at a place called the Rail Yards. The Rail Yards was sold to a California company for $8 million about 10 years ago on a contract to develop the rail yards for a long-term project. We are sitting in the same space 8 years removed from selling that building to this California company for master development. The city of Albuquerque just purchased back the rail yards. We are going to go and approach in 3 phases the remediation that needs to happen at the rail yards for sake of figuring out what we do with it. But sitting on an external contract for 8 years to the tune of $8 million was no longer something that we could sit on for much longer. So we've purchased it back. It's going to take us more than this administration's time in office to figure it out, but we're committed to like phase 1 of the rail yards being something that our city owns. So embracing who we are, owning what we created, and then building a future that and an economy that works for everybody is really the work that we've been doing.
Great. Fabulous. Thank you, Carlos. So lots of ideas resonating, but I want to open up the floor now to your own questions and input, and encourage the panelists. Feel free to jump in and respond to one another or ask questions. I have a long list of questions I could ask myself, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So if you do ask a question, can I ask you just to introduce yourself briefly, state your question, and then we'll get some responses. Right there.
Hi. Rosa Langley, Director of Development, Dallas Contemporary. For Ken, I was wondering about the fate of the 2 programs that you recommended when you were a consultant. Did they happen, and what was their kind of impact, and was it what you had expected?
So I can't actually answer that question. I can tell you that they did begin those programs, but our contract ended, and so we have not followed up. We generally don't. Once we're done, we're done. My understanding is that they did have an initial very positive beginning, but it's now, 2 years out, so it's not that far into it, but I can't really tell you in detail how they've done, other than my impression is, and my understanding was that they had a good beginning.
Questions up here and back there?
And Christine Reset, I'm at SMU. I'm a student of the MIAM International Arts Management Program. And I was thinking, Carlos, deciding to develop businesses rather than attracting a big national business, to look at your internal economic resources probably helps mitigate the act of gentrification if you're taking people who are currently in Albuquerque, currently housed, and giving them the money rather than bringing in a lot of people from outside, from California, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it encourages the idea of avoiding gentrification, right? I think within that move, you still have to, we were talking about this last night, how you still have to be very careful about what you do in spaces and how that displaces people. We're very aware of the fact that as we develop, say, the rail yards, the Barelas community that lives around it, unless they're part of the conversation, unless it lends to commerce in the area in a way that makes sense, we are not doing them any favors, right? So we can work with a local contractor and construction and design company to build whatever we want at the rail yards if in doing that local procurement and project, we push out people that have been in the neighborhood for 50, 75, 100 years. We've done everyone a disservice. So it's a little bit less of a slippery slope, but it's still something to keep an eye on very much so. We also think it's just from a point of genuine authenticity. There are things in Albuquerque that don't exist anywhere else in the world. So we may as well create the opportunity to export those things to the wider world at a higher clip. And then with that comes the trust that you build with communities. So.
Thank you. Hi there, I'm Emily Guthrie with Fine Arts Chamber Players, and Elizabeth, I had a question for you. You talked about the importance of arts institutions responding to events, and our news cycle right now churns at an unbelievable rate. So I'm wondering, for organizations that have programming, that's laid out for a year or 2 years, when does something become stale, right? I mean, if there's something that was in the news cycle 18 months ago, I mean, quite frankly, we're still feeling the ripple effects, but when is it past and irrelevant, and how do you suss that out?
When people stop coming. I'm sort of sorry that I phrased it by pointing to the news cycle, because while that's true, it's sort of parallel and masking the underlying events that are the actual need, because the news is going to find something to write about because that's how they sell the news. And I think the hard thing is distinguishing between sort of the hype and hysteria of a story needing to spin and what's actually going on in people's lives that they need to deal with. And I think the converse problem is in some ways bigger, is the news cycle moves on and finds something else new and shiny to look at. The problem's still there, it's just not getting attention. So I think that for any cultural organization, the skill is learning to listen not to the news, but to the people behind the news, and saying, is this right, is this important to you, is it still important to you? Yeah, I know they left and the cameras aren't there anymore, but do you still have a role for us to help you deal with it?
Greg, there's a couple of them.
Hi, my name is Courtney. I'm also with the SMU Masters in International Arts Management program. Carlos, I have a question for you. So as artists, we tend to have sort of an innate fear and distrust of government offices and stuff like that. How do you find that your role and those around the table with you, how do you manage bridging the gap between your government office and the community that you serve?
That's probably been the most challenging thing of it all, right? Like, I still am a little freaked out walking in nowhere, so I can completely understand. The chief of staff messes with me all the time, actually, like, come and be like, how are you today? What's interesting about this administration is in accepting the position, it was a negotiation. It wasn't just like, do you want the job, yes or no? In accepting the job, I said, I'm a father, I'm a master's student, I own my own small business, and I sell my art on the side, like through social media. So I'm a very active person outside of now being appointed in this space. If you can deal with that, then let's have a conversation. If I am putting all those things away to come work for the Keller administration, then I'm not interested. And the reality of that is that it was a back and forth, and there was some compromise and give and take. But coming out of a space of being kind of a community organizer and highly visible artist, if I was asked to put all of those things away, it's kind of like cutting off my knees and then cutting me off at the knees and asking me to run, right? Like, the network that I've developed should help this administration get things accomplished in the community. The simple point of trust that people have in me, being invited to that space, often allows them to accept that invitation when they wouldn't have before. So, and then we have a mayor that I don't know how many of you know, but he's the metal mayor. So, like, he's a metal music fan. Like, he's an avid sports guy. So we have a minor league, or like an arena football team. He, during the season, played in an arena football game. Every time a metal band comes to town that he enjoys, he introduces the metal band on stage. And to a degree, on the back end, our communications people are like, not everybody likes that. Like, some people want you to put the football down and get off the stage, and his response to that is that he's a whole person, right? That, like, there are days spent hammering away at policy and access and equity and inclusion, and then guess what? If I want to go throw a football, at the end of the day, I'm going to go throw a football. And so in that space, and seeing somebody that's a whole person as the commander-in-chief allows us to be whole people still. And I think we've maintained our trust with our network and our communities.
And we have another one back there afterwards.
Hi, I'm Kimberly Banks, and my question is for Ken. When you spoke about the 125 stakeholders that you interviewed, did you interview people who don't come? Because I want to understand how you engage those who aren't coming to make it more relevant for them.
So you want to know how we engage those who do not come?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we definitely did speak with people who do not come, and I can't actually tell you the selection process, so I can't tell you what cohort or where they were from. Their information played in with all the other information, and it was consistent, actually, whether people were coming or not. is that they felt that there wasn't enough of a connection. And they also felt, and this was critical to our thinking as the consultants, they felt they wanted and I'm obviously synthesizing and boiling down a lot of input here, but they felt that they wanted a greater connection, but they didn't want to be told what that connection should be, right? They wanted to help design it themselves, which was part of our idea. Go into the community for a year and listen, find out what they would like to do, figure out how you can use your assets to do that, and then help to make sure that that continues on. That's kind of what the overarching arc is. But I guess my real response would be just that we didn't aim specifically for the people who weren't coming, but we found that their response was really, and their need was was consistent with the needs of the people who were coming. So there was a gap all the way around. Can I just go back to the question that was asked of me before for a moment, because something has been sticking in my mind about it. And I just want to say that part of what I'm trying to get across here or communicate is that not everything that I would recommend or that people will try is going to be successful, but I'm trying to emphasize a shifting frame of reference or a shifting point of view that allows you to look at whatever your needs are and whatever your issues are from a different way than you've been doing it. If I, as the director of City Ballet, think that all we do is put ballets on the stage, oh my God, people aren't coming anymore, well, that's kind of a circular, there's a word for it, I can't remember, it's a circular loop that's never going to change. So somehow I have to change some piece of that equation. I know that, for example, just to be very brief about it, the Wallace Foundation has given an inordinate amount of money to a number, I think it's 7 organizations over a multi-year period to look at their ticket sales, their declining audiences. And my good friend Cookie Ruiz at Ballet Austin is one of those communities. And she's very clear when I talk to her, listen, we're halfway through this, we're 4 years in, we have no idea if it's going to work in the end to build our audiences. But they have completely turned around their programming, their marketing, the way that they try and build their audiences. And so I just want to emphasize that not everything will work, but you've got to be able to critically step back and think about, how can I do this differently to keep myself relevant to the community I'm trying to communicate with?
Mm-hmm. And I want to just add, we brought this up yesterday. So last week there was a conference called Grantmakers in the Arts, which is all of the public and private funders of arts and culture from around the country. And there are about 500 or so people there. And over 3 days of conference, there was a lot of talk about investing in artists, lots of talk about investing in civic engagement, in creative placemaking, in equity, diversity, inclusion, and almost not once in the 3 days did anyone mention arts organizations. So I wonder about, there's the entire arts ecology as arts organizations, those of us here in this room, we fit in there somewhere, but this conversation, if we are losing audience members because of a question of relevance, and we're going to lose relevancy with those who fund arts and culture at an institutional level. Is this kind of the wake-up call of, how could you have Grantmakers in the Arts not talk about arts organizations for 3 days? What did we get wrong that we got left out of that conversation? Do we risk, at one point, as 501c3 arts organizations, no longer getting funding from foundations and state arts agencies because the funding's now going to go for all of the other parts of the ecology? I said a bit provocatively, but I'm curious to hear thoughts about that, and then I promise I'll let you guys go back to the question asking. What are your thoughts?
I think it's a huge question, and I think it is actually, there's a lot of potential for that to happen. I have seen, I'm based in New York, I know many of the program officers at those foundations that traditionally support 501c3s. Some of them have completely shifted their philanthropic strategies and where they want to put their money. Some of them have really shifted and are very focused on the practice of artists no longer happening through 501c3s. So I think that there is a great question that you're posing, Zannie, and I think there is a great danger that that could happen, and it's one of the reasons that I'm such an advocate for organizations really focusing on what is the why of what they do and not the how they do it, because I believe that any organization as I've tried to articulate through my experience with this symphony orchestra, that any organization with the right mindset can change what they do and still be relevant and still maintain their mission, honestly, without really just chasing the funding or something else.
I think the other thing that organizations can do is they can work with grantmakers to show how using that funding as capital to create sustainable ongoing programs, they can solidify and increase the longevity of the impact of the grant funding. Because if those funders are here next year and in 10 years and in 20 years giving that money directly to artists, that's great. But if they go away, or if the money they give can't meet the need, there's the hole again. If organizations go and not just say, here's this good program you could fund, it was great, it's gone. If they can say, we can figure out how to build a sustainable model to provide the kind of support that the arts needs, and if you help us get that up and running, we'll be here in 10 or 20 years because we're not going to keep coming back to you every year for the operating funds. That's saying we can take your money and amplify it to do something bigger and better that will still be here decades from now.
I'd just like to add that the sort of the frustration is that, so what you pointed out is the work that's happening on the ground, and the important work was not part of the conversation and discussion with the funders. And that's a big piece of where we are and where I think we're going to continue to be. You talk about working with the funders. The reality is nonprofits is that we look for opportunities and we find that alignment based on the funders' commitment and focus, and then you write that grant. But the piece is that there's really, at least in the context of the work that we do, we have very little real significant conversations and discussions about how I'm talking about a funder in our organization, how we could actually expand and grow and understand what their focus is and what our focus and needs are. Those things don't happen very often. They happen on occasion. They usually happen with sort of family funds and private trusts, but the larger sort of institutions of philanthropy don't necessarily have those conversations. And the other piece that we talked about last night as well is that there are like funding trends that happen, and right now equity, inclusion, and opportunity are them. It's about time that funders finally caught up with this. But the piece of it is that in 2 or 3 years it's going to be something different and something new. So I think for us as organizations is that we stay true north, we believe in our core beliefs, and then we have to just be really smart about sort of prospecting for the kind of funders that are going to get this work and why we're doing it. And there is an evolution and a change that happens in this work. There's a lot of, the thing for us that is complicated is the intersectionality of all of the things that we do. And again, it's not as easy as, again, looking for arts funding, looking for educational funding, looking for youth development funding. We've got, I just think that the more that we can remind the funders about the expansive and complications of the arts, the better they're going to be, and ultimately us, right?
Thank you. There's a question in the back. Lady, her hand up.
Hi, Doug Kinsey. I'm president of, Audience Strategies for the Arts, Inc. I was privileged to work with the Dallas Symphony for 17 years, been working with Plano Symphony for over a decade, and privileged to work with many others. Your recent conversation here makes me want to ask 2 questions, if I may. Mr. Hinojosa, congratulations on your education program. That is just first rate. And I was curious, your comment about a very important element about that, which was parental involvement. You even mentioned a contract.
Yeah.
And I was wondering about what they said, and in the areas you work in, about the kind of parenting issues you find, single parent homes, whatever, and if those contracts aren't lived up to, et cetera. And if I may, just because of what you said, possibly as a follow-up, I'd be very curious, because I'm constantly frustrated how little mainline press coverage covers this kind of good work. If any of your work was shared through external press and media from interest, if you don't mind, 2 questions.
Sure.
Thank you for that question. The contract again becomes the baseline. So we work really, there are levels and layers because again, the complications of the constituency that we serve, many of our families are low economically focused. Many are single parents who are focused on just trying to have 2 or 3 jobs to make a living. But the piece that we do, so within the context of the application process and interview process, a parent and a student both have to be part of that. And we work to significantly train our teaching artists and others who conduct the interview to make sure that we're a bilingual organization as well, so Spanish is important in the work that we do. But the piece is that we work to make sure that everybody understands what they're getting into and what they're getting involved in. And then we do an orientation, but then the other piece that's really important, even though we have a lot of students, is we take a one-to-one approach, an individualized approach, because we recognize the complications of life and families and issues. And so that's an important part of the pieces that we do. And then more importantly, so just a sort of really quick brief overview, we are tuition free. We're gonna provide you with amazing mentorship and teaching artists. We're gonna provide you with the materials, the equipment, the supplies. You as a student have to commit to the time that you're gonna spend here. So you have to come at least 10 hours a week, so that's a real commitment on the students' part. Parents have to commit that they're gonna get their kids here, and they're gonna make sure that they get home. And then the other piece that gets really complicated, and this is where we work in partnership. So most of our parents have never filled out a FAFSA. They don't know what that is, but it's one of the requirements of the contract. Our students have to apply to 5 universities. They have to apply for 4 colleges. They have to visit 3 higher educational places. And so doing that with kids who don't know the first thing, we work collaboratively. We have orientations. We have FAFSA workshops so parents and students can come in. So it's just like, we're not going to say, this is your part, this is our part. It's a collaborative process that really works. But finally what it does is it starts the foundation of knowing what the expectations are. It's a competitive program to get into, but the reality is that even a 6th grader coming into our program has to apply. And unfortunately, sometimes they don't get in. But it's also part of the life lessons of life, right? If you want to go to a magnet school, you've got to apply. If you want to go to university, you have to apply. If you want to get a job, it's a competitive process. And what we're hoping to do is, besides the sort of creative focus and the other issues, is giving them the kind of life skills that they're going to need to know for the rest of their lives.
We've got time for one more question.
Yes, I'm Jennifer Jafari. I'm development for the Plano Civic Chorus. Our communities all say that we're assets to the community, and the corporations that invest in us, it seems to be that they give money and many times sustainable over several years. But for the panel, I'd like to talk a little bit about how do we convert corporations and foundations to partners in our success and vice versa. And by that I mean we have one donor, for example, a large hospital in the area, and we provide concerts for their employees. And many people are first-time attendees. We have programs for children. And how do you grow that relationship so it's sustainable, visible, and people who normally wouldn't participate in the arts would, have some visibility to what we offer.
Thank you. Who wants to jump in on that one?
Well, I'll start. I think I actually hear two questions. One is really how to deal with the corporate side or the foundation side, and the other is how to deal with audiences that may not have been exposed to it before, to whatever the product is before or the art is. And I would, first of all, say that it's important to not conflate those, that those are two very different, they might have a place where they intersect, but those are two very different things that might need to be addressed. In the case of the corporations and foundations, where I think you started your question, I would say that it's very tough. And what I mean by that is, in my lifetime, I have seen corporations and foundations just change. And I think part of what I would say, and I haven't really articulated this, so I'd have to think about it a little further, is I think part of what we ought to consider as a community, and I think this might be what others were alluding to, is sustainability. And we've gotten to a place, at least most of the people that I know, and I'm speaking very generally here, where we get a grant from somebody, a 3-year grant from the Mellon Foundation. They think that we're building sustainability. We put it into our operations, and at the end of 3 years, we're looking for that money again because we haven't built a sustainable replacement. So I think part of the answer is that we have to be cognizant of the needs of our community of funders. These are what these corporations and foundations are. And we can't just expect that they will continue to fill the hole that we have. And we all know that we have an endless hole. No matter how much money we have, we will need more money because that's the nature of what we do. And I know from being a lighting designer, however much time I have on the stage or we have on the stage, we will use that time. You give us half the time, we'll get to show up in half the time. You give us twice as much time, we'll use it.
Do it. Yeah.
And that all has a financial cost to it and has implications. So I guess part of what I would say is that I think it's a mistake to think that any source of funding is interminable, is that the word? That it won't end. And I would go back to my basic fundraising, what I've learned about fundraising is, which is it's about relationships. And if I build the right relationship, and if I can find what it is the funder, the donor, is interested in, that will make them feel good, there's no problem with them writing that check. If I can't, there is a problem with them writing that check. So I think that's really what I would say, is that it's a question of approach, and there may not be the answer, an answer rather, as to how to do that in a permanent way.
Well, we're not going to stop this conversation entirely. I'm just going to put it on the pause button long enough for us to walk across the street. Everyone who has registered for the lunch, you should have a table number that you were given. If you would please sit at the table, at that table and not another one. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to ask you to please consider, in your discussions at the table, what hit home. And think about, what is a first step? Where do we start? If we wanted to have meaningful change in better understanding our community and its needs, and what directions do we need to take in order to adapt to become more relevant? How do we start that process? At the end of lunch, we're going to have, as I said, the table hosts, and we'll report out for those who want to share what their ideas were. And let's see if we can't take home for Dallas a big idea that's going to help us to increase both the largeness and the depth of the reach of arts and culture in North Texas. So table hosts are Ann Bothwell, Megan Bowden-Wilkinson, Mary Brewer, Zanetta Drew, Celeste Glover, Leah Harris, Dayron Miles, Suzanne Smith, Jeremy Strick, and different TACA staff. So look for these individuals at your table. Do we have the different Perforum committee members in the room? Please raise your hand. I want to thank these folks because this was a big joint effort to organize the panel today. Thank you. And I want to ask you to please join me in thanking Carlos Contreras, Elizabeth Merritt, John Hinojosa, and Ken Tabachnik for taking the time to come to Dallas, Texas on a Monday to share the good work that you're doing in your community. Thank you. Let's have lunch.